Hello, Internet. I would like to talk today about King Arthur, the historical King Arthur. And what does that mean? It means no swords and stones, no swords and anvils, round tables, no magic, none of that sort of thing. What do I mean? Well, by saying the historical King Arthur, I've begged the question. I've presumed that there was a King Arthur. So let me say right away that I'm not here to claim that there was such a person, still less that he was a king. Now, many historians and famous people did think that there was a real man behind the legend. Edward Gibbon, for instance, Winston Churchill, as a couple of examples. Myself, I think it was very likely that there was someone behind the legend. But in this video, I'm concerned with looking at the best evidence for someone who could be called the historical Arthur. In other words, what is the evidence and how good is it? Okay, this means that we have to be detectives. We have to look for clues, for evidence. We have to be judges in that we have to weigh the evidence and decide how seriously to take it. So what evidence is there? When people think of King Arthur, I imagine most people think of a medieval king presiding over a court peopled with elegant ladies, the sort that wear veils and tall pointed hats, and of course knights in shining armor. And this, of course, is the world of medieval romance, the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Thomas Malory, and many others. It's wonderful stuff in its own right, of course, and it's culturally very important, artistically very, very important. But these are works of fiction written hundreds of years after any historical Arthur might have lived. And I don't think we can learn anything about him, really, from these historical romances. I know that out in the internet world, there are some who will disagree with this and say that there is something historical in the medieval romances. But I have to say that I don't really think that's the case. And this talk is not about what we can supposedly take from the medieval romance. This is a talk about historical documents and what we know from history. So I talked a little while ago about evidence. And so what is there for evidence? Well, clearly the best evidence would be contemporary evidence, either written or archaeological. And failing that, we want evidence from the closest time to the period in question. So what is the period then? Well, it's the Dark Ages. I'm not going to get into a discussion here about how dark they were or weren't. I know some people have very strong feelings about that, but it's a very useful term for the period we're talking about. And the term distinguishes this period from the High or later Middle Ages, during which most of the Arthurian romances were written. But before we get to the Dark Ages, we need to look briefly at the Roman Empire. Look at the map. You'll notice an island in the upper left-hand corner, and of course, well, more than one island. Those are the islands of Britain. Of course, the northwest extremity of the Roman Empire. Here's a close-up of Roman Britain. That's the area in red. The rest of the map, or the rest of the island, remained outside of the empire. The conquest of Britain began in earnest under the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD and was completed for the most part about 44 years later. There was a famous revolt under Queen Boudica about the year 60 or 61 AD, which was put down. And over the centuries, Roman Britain suffered invasions from what is now Scotland, from Ireland, from what's now Germany. Roman Britain, however, remained part of the Roman Empire for about 360 years, eventually being divided into 4 British provinces. From the late 360s, however, troops were drawn from Britain to support usurpers who attempted unsuccessfully to capture the throne of the Western Empire. The Roman Empire at this time was divided into eastern and western halves. A result of this was that the number of Roman troops in Britain by the start of the 5th century had dwindled, leaving Britain prey to barbarian raids and from Ireland and from the continent. In 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius, in response to a request from British provincial councils who had requested help from the Roman government, told them to look after their own defenses. And from this time on, apparently there was no direct Roman rule over Britain. Left to their own devices, the British invited Germanic tribesmen to settle in Britain and, in return for land, defend the British from their enemies. This was a typical late Roman arrangement, such as the Roman government itself had concluded with other barbarian tribes. Territory was given to those tribes within the borders of the empire in return for military service. In the long run, it didn't end particularly well for the Romans. The Germanic tribesmen carved out their own kingdoms, which became the kingdoms, the states of modern Europe eventually. In Britain, the result over time was the settlement of further German tribesmen, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who over the course of a century or so managed to take over much of the territory of the former Roman provinces in Britain. The blue area shows where these Germanic peoples spread, and this map shows their kingdoms roughly by the mid-500s. The period during which we should look for Arthur is between the end of Roman rule and the end of British rule in the former Roman provinces, apart from the area that became Wales. So, say between 435 and 530 AD. We need to look for some sort of military leader here. So we ask the question, are there any written records from this period about Arthur by anyone who knew him? And the answer is unfortunately no. Did anyone else from this period write about him? By the way, this would help pin down the time during which he might have lived, but the answer again is no. And yet somehow the Arthurian legend was born, and it grew into one of the most important in Western culture. Are there any early references to him? Well, yes, there are. But they have to be judged carefully. There are 4 early sources: a Welsh poem, a roughly contemporary religious tract, a set of annals, and an early Welsh history. So let's take a look at these sources. Before we get to them, we might note an interesting phenomenon, that during the 6th and 7th centuries, a number of Celtic princes were named Arthur. This certainly suggests that the name, which I don't think is attested before this, must be tied to some impressive person of that name from some time earlier. So this too is evidence of a sort. But let's get back to the written sources. What may be the earliest is a Welsh battle poem, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation because I don't speak Welsh. The poem is called, I believe, Y Gadadden. This poem recounts a British defeat by Angles in the Battle of Catraeth about the year 600 AD. Here's a picture of a page from the medieval manuscript in which it survives. The poem itself, though, is earlier than the manuscript, possibly as early as the 600s, though possibly as late as the 1000s. If it is from the 600s, then it may contain the earliest reference to Arthur. Translated into English, the reference is this, quote, "He fed the black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur. Among the powerful ones in battle, in the front rank, Gwarthur was a palisade," end quote. Now let's remember, if there was an Arthur, he's to be found somewhere here. So even if the poem dates back to the 600s, there's something of a gap between it and Arthur's life. Still, it's not so long a gap, and it seems to me that that's true for a figure who had apparently become something of a legend, even if the poem is not as old as that. The next source that I'd like to talk about is a religious tract by a British monk named Gildas. The general opinion is that he lived in the 500s, though there are some who would place him earlier, a bit earlier. He wrote something called the De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, which means something like about the decline and conquest of Britain. In it, he criticized a number of contemporary British rulers, kings, for their various moral failings. In it is found an interesting passage about a struggle over the years between the British and their barbarian enemies, apparently the Saxons or Angles and Jutes. So we'll just call them Germanics for the moment, the ancestors of the English. He writes, and this is my translation, but we have the original Latin for you to look at, and let me know in the comments if you disagree with the translation. "From that time now the citizens, now the enemy were victorious, up to the year of the siege of Mountbatten, almost the last but not the least, slaughter of the criminals, 44 years and 1 month have passed, as I know, which is the year of my birth, end quote. This is, as I say, my translation. Look at the Latin. If you disagree, certainly put something in the comments. Now, the passage is vexing for many reasons, apart from its difficult style. We don't know exactly when Gildas lived, and while he mentions the Battle of Mount Badon, and we're going to see this was a particularly important battle, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, he doesn't name the victor, whether that victor was Arthur or anybody else. What exactly does Gildas mean by ex eo tempore? In other words, from that time. From what time? From the date of the Battle of Badon, or from the arrival of the Saxons, which is discussed right before this passage? It seems that it must mean one of these two, but they are years and years apart. Most scholars think that the time, nowadays most scholars today think that the time referred to as the Battle of Badon, but there are others who think it refers to the arrival of the Saxons referred to earlier in the text, and this other interpretation seems to have been more common in the Middle Ages. In any case, it's quite unclear which way to take it. And Gildas doesn't mention the victor of Badon, so why do I bring this passage up? I think you'll see shortly. So let's talk about another early history text, that of the Historia Brittonum. This is a book whose Latin text, or Latin title rather, means the history of the Britons, and it's been traditionally ascribed to a monk named Nennius. Lately there's been some doubt about whether he was in fact the fellow who wrote it, but this doesn't really matter for our purposes. It seems to have been written around the year 830 AD, so it was written about 300 or more years after any activity of Arthur, and we don't know what sources the author used. That would be very good to know, of course, but we don't. All the same, it is a very interesting book. It mentions Arthur explicitly, and it states that he won 12 battles. Here's the Latin text, and this is from the edition of Theodor Mommsen, the famous 19th century German scholar. Here is my translation of the Latin text for those of you who are interested. If we just cut to the battles, we see something interesting, and it's this. It's not clear where any of them are to be located. Now, there are a number of speculations about them. Some say, first of all, that the number 12 is suspect because it's often found in myths and legends. And certainly, it's true. 12 is a number found in myth and legend. Others point out something else, that if the list were a medieval forgery, or something concocted in the 800s, we might expect to recognize the places where the battles took place, the names of these places, or at least some of them. Okay? Because, after all, what use would place names be if they were not recognized? However, that's not the case. Even the city of the legion is not certain, as cities had arisen near legionary camps, and legions had been posted in several cities during Roman times. So, for example, is the city of the legion Chester? Is it York? Is it some other place? The argument is, therefore, that these battles are not forgeries put in by the author of the Historia Brittonum because we can't locate them. What's the good of a forgery if it doesn't tie into things that the audience knows? So we see that the Historia Brittonum, we see in the Historia Brittonum, however, that the victory at the Battle of Badon, a battle mentioned by Gildas in a much earlier text, is attributed to Arthur. Another interesting point is that the Arthur referred to is not a king, but a war leader or leader of battles. In Latin, he's called Dux Bellorum, and there are two things here. Nennius, or whoever wrote the Historia Brittonum, has not chosen to cast Arthur as a king or elevate him to that status, which you might expect of a legendary national figure, national at least for the Welsh of the time. And furthermore, the title is vaguely reminiscent of certain late Roman military titles, such as Dux Britanniarum, the Duke or leader of the British provinces, or even simply Dux, which was one of the terms for a Roman military commander generally. Dux, from which we get our word duke, is a leader, not a king. But the title might just be seen to echo late antique terminology, and if so, that's interesting. Finally, our last written source is another document in Latin, the Annales Cumbriae, or in English, the Welsh Annals. These annals are a chronicle, a list of years, and along the right margins of the pages are listed, very briefly, major events that had taken place that year. For the most part, they are events that took place in Britain. The manuscript dates back to the 1100s, but it's a copy of earlier manuscripts, and the events go back centuries earlier. Now, of interest to us are two particular entries, that for the year 72 and that for the year 93. Now, you have to understand that the annals do not use the dating system we use now. Those numbers are the numbers of the years in an Easter cycle. This means that the numbers repeat eventually. And this means that we have to decide, therefore, which years 72 and 93 correspond to. But first, let's see what the entries for those years say. Here is the Latin text from the Welsh Annals. And here is the English translation. Battle of Baden, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were victors. The other one reads, Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Madraut fell, and there was death in Britain and Ireland. It's interesting here to see a mention of the Battle of Baden, just as we do in Gildas, and in fact, just as we do in Nennius. Here the victory is clearly attributed to Arthur. Note that, again, that he's not called a king. The earliest entries in the Welsh annals seem to have been taken from Irish annals. This doesn't mean that they're inaccurate, of course, though some believe that the Arthur entries were added centuries later. We don't know that that's so. So what years do 72 and 93 correspond to? If we look at other events in the annals, which we know about from other sources, they seem to correspond to the years 516 and 537 AD. However, if some of the entries come from earlier annals and were incorporated into the Welsh annals, there's always the chance that they were not put into the right years. Remember that we are dealing here with years numbered in a repeating Easter cycle. So a systematic error could be introduced. I mention this because some scholars argue that the Battle of Baden was earlier than 516, and that Gildas, who refers to it, may have lived somewhat earlier than previously thought. We're not talking about great differences, say about a half a century earlier, but they are possibilities. So that's the evidence. Let's weigh it. First, the Welsh poem. The poem does suggest that Arthur was well known in the 6th century, that is, back in the 500s, though the date of the poem's composition is not known. Gildas mentions the Battle of Baden, which is helpful, though he doesn't attribute it to any particular leader. A date for the battle between 485 and 520 seems implied, depending upon the interpretation of his unclear language. Nennius calls Arthur, or mentions Arthur, whom he calls a war leader rather than king, something less grand, and he mentions 12 battles, which may be a suspect number, though the places are not susceptible of easy identification, or certain identification, I should say. This seems to argue against forgery. So it seems to me does this. If the entries are forgeries intended to elevate a national hero, why not make him a king, and why not put him in places that were easily recognized? He mentions the Battle of Baden, which ties in with Gildas, though we don't know what his sources were, and we don't know whether he is reporting independently or repeating what Gildas said. The Welsh annals tell us, as Nennius does, that Arthur was a war leader, not a king, that he was the victor at Baden, and that he was killed at the Battle of Camlan. The years may have been 516 and 537, or not. However, we don't know whether the entries were made contemporaneously. Some argue that the Arthur entries are later forgeries, but of course we don't know. However, once again, it is worth asking this: if the entries are late forgeries, why is Arthur not said to be a king? After all, Arthur was a king in medieval romances by this time. We don't know whether the early entries, apparently incorporated from another chronicle, were included in the right years, though this doesn't defeat claims about the historicity of Arthur, but it does make the dates uncertain. If we weigh all of this evidence, what seems likely to be true? Well, my view, for what it's worth, is that there is evidence for a military commander called Arthur in the late 5th or early 6th centuries, who won a number of battles against barbarian raiders, probably Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and possibly others such as Picts or Irish. He seems likely to have been a victorious commander at the Battle of Baden, who knows where, and probably fell in a battle called the Battle of Camlan, again, who knows where, about 20 years later. From these events, somehow the King Arthur legend sprang up and became rather elaborated, so elaborated, in fact, that it eclipsed his post-Roman Dark Age origins. So, in sum, I would say that a fair case can be made for the existence of an historical Arthur, but I am afraid that we cannot know a great deal about him. If you found this talk interesting, I'd ask you to consider reading my historical novel, Quirinius, which deals with the Arthurian legends from a late Roman point of view, which I think is rather novel. Give it a look. And take a look at my blog, if you would. Thank you.